Hi folks, and welcome back. This is sketch number 6, our penultimate sketch in this series. And if you don't recognise this, it's the amazing building, stunning architecture of Grand Central Station in New York City. Now on the face of it, this looks really complicated, probably quite intimidating to a lot of people, especially anyone that doesn't have a great deal of experience with their sketching. But don't worry about that, we're going to take it one step at a time. There's lots of things that we can do to simplify this. And actually, when you scratch beneath the surface, as an overall structure, it isn't that complicated. And particularly in the style that we're doing, a quick sketch, we don't have to worry about lots of the small, intricate details that would be otherwise very time consuming. Now, the most important part of this reference, and the reason that I chose it, is that compositionally, I think it's quite strong because of the perspective that's going on. So if you think back to that first sketch that we did of the old ruins, if you saw that one, I spoke briefly about how one-point perspective draws the viewer's eye into a central focal point and how that's quite compelling. It's quite compelling to look at. We've got that going on here, and we've also got something called three-point perspective going on as well, which I'm going to touch on briefly in just a moment. And what that 1-point and 3-point perspective does is creates quite a dramatic and compelling vantage point and vista for the viewer to see the scene from. And I think that means that we'll be able to create quite a nice sketch, even if all of the details and all of the features of the architecture are put in really quickly and really loosely. So if you're not sure what 1-point, 2-point and 3-point perspective is, let me just show you very quickly on a scrap bit of paper. So the 1-point perspective, if you've got a single point there, means that all of the horizontals on the right and left hand side of the image would all meet if extended into a central point. So if you've got a building on the left hand side here, and just imagine some windows, one on the right hand side, and put some windows on this level. All of the top and bottom lines of the windows and all of the roof lines and the floor lines would all, if extended, meet to a central point. And if you want to get really kind of accurate with your perspective, the way that a lot of people do this is to extend all of their pencil marks and their lines to this point and then erase them later on. But that's not something that we want to do in a quick sketch, and it's not something that you need to do in order for your perspective, for all the various features to look right to the eye. Now that's the 1-point perspective. 3-point perspective is where the verticals all meet at a point in the sky. Okay, in this example, if you were looking down, they would meet at a point on the ground. So let's say, for example, this is some sort of kind of skyscraper building, and we're looking up at it from a ground level or a worm's eye view. So there's my amazing figure drawing. Feel free to copy that. And then you've got all of the various levels of the windows that would obviously get closer together as they get closer to the top. So this third point of perspective affects the verticals. Now if I just bring back the iPad and we'll just show you the scene again, and I'm just going to grab a ruler. So you can see that on the right hand side here, we've got the ground level, the right hand wall. If we took that to an imaginary point, let's say it was somewhere there, somewhere in the center, all of the horizontals on this right hand wall would all meet to a point that is going to be probably just above this clock face. So we've got one there, we've got this one, all of the lines of the brickwork would all meet to that, the bottom of the flag, the top of the flag, even a line, an imaginary line that runs across the top of these archways would all run down to the same point. And then you'd have the same on the left hand side. So you've got all of the horizontals running to a point. And then if we look at the verticals on the back wall, these central pillars, well, they do look like they're straight up, but this edge is sloping in, this one here is sloping in a bit more, this one is sloping here. So again, they're creating this kind of pyramid effect if you were to extend those lines with your pencil, your pen, whatever. Now the big angles that you can see in this reference, the most obvious ones, so this top line here is a very obvious one. The top line for these pillars here, the bottom line where it meets the floor, same on the left hand side. These angles are much more important, these big basic angles, more important than all of the intricacies of the architecture, the various features, the clock, the people that are walking around. They're just details and supporting acts. We want to get the big structure right first. Same for the verticals, so we want to make sure that the angles of these, they don't have to be deadly accurate compared to what's on your reference, but they have to be consistent. Now, the other important characteristic of this particular building, and also the position that the photographer has taken the photograph from, that differs from all our previous sketches, is the amount of symmetry that's going on in this scene. So if I was to draw a line straight down the middle, this right-hand side is a mirror image to the left-hand side. The angle of this line is the same, but in a kind of mirrored reverse to the angle of this line. You haven't got a flatter line here and a steeper line here. You've also got lots of symmetry with the windows and the position of these windows. This one is dead center. This one is an equal amount of distance to the left as this one is to the right. Same with the stairs. And all of these pillars are opposite one another. That overall sense of symmetry is more important to convey than all of the supporting details. And that's actually good news for us, because what it means is that as long as we put in a basic structure and we get that right, so a basic right-hand wall, a basic left-hand wall, a simplified archway, some simplified windows, as long as we get that in good perspective and some nice symmetry going on, all the other little bits and pieces, you can cherry pick how many or how few you put in to act as supporting features. All right, so enough talking. I think it's time that we get on and do this sketch. I just wanted to lay that little bit of groundwork just because I know a lot of people will look at a scene like this and think it's too complicated, it's beyond me. It really isn't. I think, you could be pleasantly surprised if we go through this simplified process. So again, I'm going to keep the sketch to the top half of a sheet of A4 American letter size paper. Just put a few little dots there just across the middle so I know not to go too far down. Leave a bit of room for sketch number 7 at the bottom. And then because that symmetry is quite important, I want that to be a feature of this sketch, I'm just going to put a few dots for an approximate centre line, again, in the area that I'm working. And that is just going to help me to draw the archway at the back with a little more symmetry and make sure that the sketch is in the centre of my little workspace. So we're going to be focusing on the big blocks of this structure. So the obvious first big block is this archway here, but before I even draw that in, I'm going to look for a line that represents one of the horizontals that I can see. Now, it might be that you choose the floor line where the floor meets this wall here, but I'm going to choose the one that just represents this first level. So this little mezzanine that you can see there just below the 3 big windows. And I'm just roughly looking at this sort of area here, this space relative to this space. On the reference, you can see that it's around about maybe between a quarter and a third, a little bit less than a third, maybe a little bit more than a quarter. It doesn't matter which landmark you choose. You might go for a line that represents the bottom of the windows, for example, and that's fine. That'll be a little bit higher up. What's important is that you just give some initial thought to the overall size of your sketch so that you've got enough room to fit this vista on at the bottom, the right and the left hand side. It'd be no good if I started with this archway and then realised after I've put this in, I've got not enough room to put the features in that I want to on the right, and on the left hand side I can't get any of the detail in below here. So I'm just thinking about how to split my little work surface up into these major proportions. So in the same way that I've looked at elements that represent the height, I want to think about the width as well. So the width of my archway is going to be something around about there. And I'm also looking at the distance from the centre line as well. That's just going to help me get some symmetry. And it's making sure that I've got plenty of room right and left. So now let's just put the shape for this archway in. So I'm just looking at the shape of that curve at the top. And you can see I'm using the pen quite lightly, so even though we can't erase, you can still accommodate for marks that maybe aren't accurate or good enough first time by using your pen more lightly, hit and miss marks, because that way when we put in heavier lines and the watercolour, especially some shading, any fainter lines will just disappear into the background. Okay, so then I've got this kind of wall at the bottom with the 3 archways in, the 3 tunnels in. So I'm just going to put in a horizontal to represent that. Now the next bigger structures to focus on are the right and the left hand wall, and the most important line that represents those is this top line here. So we've got an angle to this here, and I want to think about whatever angle I put that in, I want to get a mirror image of that angle this side so that the shape that is left for the ceiling is reasonably symmetrical. So if you want to, you can lay your pen over your reference photograph. If you were working from life, you could hold your pen up and close one eye and gauge that angle. I'm just going to try and do this just by looking at the reference and making a best guess. So again, put that in reasonably faint in case I need to adjust it, but I think that's okay. And then I want to look at a mirror image. Now, it's easier if you turn your paper around. I'm going to try and avoid that just so that you can see it easier on the camera. You can have a look just very quickly at where this line here breaks into this one. And then if you go across, that'll give you a little reference to help you draw your line in with a bit more symmetry. So it's a bit more of a mirror image to the first one. There we go. So it doesn't have to be deadly accurate, but this shape in here, you can see that shape in there, looks reasonably symmetrical, doesn't it? Now, before I get carried away and start putting in any of the details of the archway, the 3 windows, I still want to focus on getting the overall big structure of the building right. So the next important lines, I think, are going to be these bottom lines, so the wall to floor line. So again, just trying to judge those by eye. So it's going to be something like that. And let's try and create, again, a bit of symmetry. So I'm just looking at this floor shape here, and I want that to be a reasonably symmetrical shape, which it seems to be. So that's essentially our 1-point perspective. Everything pointing into a central location. A focal point, maybe the clock face. I think it's this window here, the center window of the 3. Everything's pointing in and taking the viewer's eye towards that point. I haven't taken these lines up to a vanishing point. If you've seen lessons on perspective before, I don't need to be that pedantic and that accurate for it to look right to the viewer's eye. So now I want to think about that third point of perspective. So how the verticals converge, the lines for the verticals converge in slightly as though they would meet at a point way up off the page. So a quick glance at the reference, I can see that the line for this furthest away pillar here has got an angle to it, but then as the pillars move closer to us, that angle increases. Okay, so this one here is going to have an angle, maybe something like that. And then the next one is going to be a bit more of an angle. And then the next one again is a steeper angle. So I'm going to put this first pillar in. So just looking at the line for the top there, and I'm drawing this line approximately parallel to this one. It is going to get a slightly flatter angle, isn't it? So it's going to fan out in this direction, and then the bottom of it would be more parallel to this line. But again, I'm not worried about trying to take it to a vanishing point. As long as it's roughly similar to this, maybe a slightly flatter line to this, it's going to look right. So our next gap between the two pillars, it's obviously the same as this, but because it's closer to us, the distance of the length of this line is going to be longer than that one. I'm not going to measure that, but as long as I show that it is actually a longer line, this one is longer than this one, again, it's going to look right. So that's 1, 2, and then we've got this third one here. And again, we want this distance to be bigger than this distance. So you can see this line here, this faint one here. It was a line that it was a sketch mark that I put in that I've then adjusted. And even though I can't erase it, I'm not worried at all, because by the time I've put in the detail, some shading, hatching marks, certainly the watercolour, this is not going to be noticeable. And if anything, it'll just add a bit of looseness and a bit of energy to your mark making. Now, if you wanted to, you could go and repeat that on this side as well, or you could start adding a bit more detail on this side. This for me is enough to give me the confidence that the overall sketch is going to be in a reasonable proportion and of a reasonable size. If I was purely sketching for my own kind of enjoyment, I would now just start indulging myself in some of the details. For the purposes of this lesson and trying to keep it reasonably sequential, let's do the opposite on this side. So I'm just going to think about how the angle of this line is roughly a mirror image of this one. Again, just to help with that symmetry. And then this top line here is going to be quite short. I can maybe put in this line as well, because this one is clearer, isn't it? On this side, we've got We've got the information board here. We've got another little structure coming out here. So there isn't this strong horizontal here, but there is on this side. And you can see if that's a steep line sloping in that way and that one sloping in that way, this line has got, it's almost horizontal, but it's just got a very slight downward slope to it. So I'm just going to pop that in there, maybe a little bit higher, just to represent the bottom of these pillars, or the gaps between the pillars. So I don't even have to really look at the reference here, because I can just copy what I've done on this side and make an approximate mirror image of that. Now, I've just realized I've made a bit of a mistake there. So this line that I put in is the bottom where the floor meets this wall here. So this line here should actually run from this point, shouldn't it? So this is going to be, again, an extraneous line, a line that I've made a mistake with, but I'm not worried. It's a rough sketch. It's not going to be a problem. Let's put this one on this side. It's I don't even think it will be visible at the end. You won't notice it, so I'm not worried about that. And then maybe we need to just bring the bottom of these pillars down slightly. So let's just put in a line for that. It's going to be somewhere around about there. All right, so let's start putting in a few more details. Still trying to focus on the bigger structures. So I'm just going to adjust the top of my archway a little bit higher. And all I'm looking at is how up the length of this little pillar here, this first pillar here, if I carry the line up, that's about where the archway meets. So I'm just going to make a slight adjustment for that. There's lots of detail and kind of intricacies within the architecture of that. So I'm going to need to put lots of lines in for that anyway. So it's not a problem extending that up slightly. And then I'm going to put this first window in. So let's try and get some nice symmetry with that. I've got my center line, or the few dots there for the center line. So that's going to help me put this in with a little bit more symmetry. And then we've got these little pillar things. Just going to put in a line to represent the top of those. So there's the first window. And then this second one runs up to about here. And then the third one. Just a faint line just across the top so I can get them roughly the same height. And then we've got these little pillar things in between them. So just a quick representation of those. And then let's just strengthen this top line. So I'm happy with the angle of that. So I'm just going to strengthen that a little bit, and then I can see how it comes in, cuts into the window. And then we've got the inside of the top of the archway. And that just touches the outer edge of that window and the outer edge of that one. Bit of detail at the bottom of each window. And then we've got these pillars. And then in between the pillars we've got these tunnels. And then we've got the mezzanine at the top there. So just put in a little bit of detail for that. I'm not going to put in all the detail of the pillars in that mezzanine, but one thing I do want to get in are the stairs and the block for the stairways, because this is all part of the focal point. And then let's not forget the clock, so let's put the right time on. So that's going to be a nice bit of colour. I think we can put a nice yellow in there and really create that as a nice strong focal point. And then we've got these steps on the outside. So again, I want to put these in with some nice symmetry. So just looking at the distance from this block here and the distance between it. Real quick and easy representation of the stairs. And then for the windows, really simply, I'm just going to put in some cross hatches, really quick. And how much detail you add is entirely up to you. It's how long you're going to spend on the sketch, how worked up you want it to be. I'm not going to add too much on, but I'm going to add a little bit more than the previous sketches that we've done. So I'm thinking about the weight of line as well now. So where I see under here, for example, there's some shadows, the edges of some of the detail on these pillars. So I'm just strengthening that line. Let's just put something in to represent these rose shapes. They're quite a distinctive part of the architecture and the focal point. So just a few dashes here. This is just to represent that there's detail going on in that area, but without having to put in lots of intricate details. Let's put a very loose impression of some texture on this back wall. Can maybe put some darker tones up here. Look how dark the windows are up at the top there. So just a little bit of hatching just coming down from the top. I don't want to go overboard with that because I think it'd be nice to get some nice watercolour washes into that. Just a quick little representation of some of the details on that mezzanine. And then let's get this booth in. So again, this is quite an important feature. It's right on the focal point. So I'm just drawing a flattened ellipse, just ghosting the pen across just so I can get a nice shape for that. And then just looking at the width, trying to keep it symmetrical in the center. So the figures we are going to put in towards the end. I'm not going to worry about them for now. I'll be able to put them in over this pen work I do. I'm not going to be worried about leaving gaps for figures or anything like that. I'll just put a little bit of detail, something and nothing, just into this booth area. This ticket office, I think it is. And then for these three archway windows up here, this side and this side, what I'm going to do is just draw in a line that represents the top of them. I'm not going to measure that line, I'm just going to draw it at a steeper angle than this one. So remember, everything is fanning out in that direction. So this top line, as long as you draw it at a slightly steeper angle, and then I'll do one on that side again, trying to maintain a bit of symmetry. And now let's just look at, I'm going to look at this little negative shape here very quickly. They don't have to be deadly accurate, these, but they are funny shapes to draw in. So something like that, again, look at the negative shape. That's what's going to help you the most. So this one, I'm just doing wider than this one. Obviously, it's closer to us. And this isn't going to really fit on my page, but I'll just get that in there. And then we've got these archways with the glass windows in. And then for this detailing, it's quite intricate and quite ornate. I'm literally just going to scribble the pen just to represent some kind of information there, but again, without having to take any time over trying to draw what is actually there. And then we can do the same on this side. So again, just looking at the negative shape that's made. All right, and then let's just tidy up the right and left hand wall. So obviously got some detailing up here. Again, I just want to give a very quick impression of this. And then for the pillars, we can start to add in some structure for these. Definitely want to get the flag in. And then I'm going to put this little structure in. So in the same way, I can look at the top of the information board. I can see that it's just slightly, slightly above the horizontal. So around about there, and then it goes through to this middle pillar. So I've got that line in and end line in. There's the end aspect of it. And then this bottom line is around about horizontal. So this bottom line here, I'm just going to have a quick look at that. It's quite a bit flatter than what I've got mine. So I'm going to adjust that. It's actually about there. So look at all these marks here, but I'm going to put people in there. It's not going to matter. I need to adjust this one on this side, which I'll do in a moment. So for the information board, let's just put in a little bit of pen work. Just leave a few gaps for just something to represent the writing that's on there, and we'll get a few little bits of red in as well. Let's just put a real kind of loose, quick representation of some stonework in. These ones here, we'll put a few on there. Again, remember your perspective line, so fanning out, not worried about taking anything to a vantage point. Same with this one. Look how quick that is. Got this nice cast shadow, so I'm actually going to put this in with a little bit of pen work. And there's one on each of these. So just a little bit of hatching. And then I'm just going to basically repeat the process on the left-hand side. All right, so how about we add some life and some figures to the sketch? Obviously, I'm not going to put them all in. I'm going to concentrate on the more obvious groups and the more obvious individual figures. Now, you may have seen Bob's post that he put on recently within the Facebook group and on our blog. Just gives you a very quick and simple way of drawing figures. So the basic concept and the basic idea of the carrot and ball method is just to do a ball for the head and then a carrot-like structure for the body. And most of our figures are going to be smaller than this, probably half that size. And the most important thing, I think, is this gap in between the head and the body portion, the ball and the carrot. If you draw it right on top of it, it just doesn't look quite as authentic as when you've got that little gap. And then if you want to add maybe a suitcase they're pulling along, you can do that. If you want to, maybe it's a smaller child, and you can vary. Obviously, you could maybe put a bit more hair on some of them, so kind of longer hair on some people. Maybe it's the back of them. So the key is thinner at the bottom, slightly wider at the shoulders, and then a little bit of a gap, unless they've got hair, obviously, that's going to be a bit longer. But the distance between here and here is a little bit longer than if you just put the ball right on top of the shoulders. So this is the basic concept that we're going to look at, and we'll just vary the shape slightly within that, leave a little bit of white space so that we can add some spot colours as well. So let's add a few around this office. So I'm going to start with this girl here. So just something to represent some hair, and then the body shape, and then she's kind of stood cross-legged, but it's just an impression. And I just want to think about the size of these relative to obviously everything else that is there. We've got a gentleman on the outside. He looks like he's got a backpack on and he's looking down his phone maybe. I've got to remember to leave some gaps for a bit of colour as well. We've got a little group on the left here. I think compositionally that's quite nice because it stops the eye from disappearing out onto the right hand side. So again, just looking at the size, that's the only thing that's going to cause you trouble if you draw some that are too big in relationship to the station as a whole. And then as we get into the distance, you can start getting quicker and more haphazard in the marks because you're given the impression. These ones here in the background, this group of people, these are literally just dots and dashes. And we'll put in some little spots of colour. Alright, I think that'll do. It just gives a little bit of an impression of life, and it's going to allow us to add some colours into the mix. So I think it's time to get the watercolours out and start adding a splash of colour. Let's add some colour then, and I think we could start with the ceiling, that nice kind of greeny turquoisey blue. So I'm going to go with some Prussian blue, and we'll just add a little touch of, I'll add a bit of the lemon yellow to that, just to make it a bit more green. That's a little bit pale. It can be a bit stronger than that. And then how about we go a little bit stronger just in some of the areas, maybe some of the corners. So same mix, but just a thicker mix. And then we just drop a bit of stronger colour just into some of those areas. And while I've got this colour to hand, I'm just going to make up a bit more of a yellow mix, maybe just some of the cadmium yellow. Just a bit more of a yellowy green. And then what we can do is use this colour for these windows. Just combine the two. So seeing it straight over the shape. Those ink lines and marks will show up, even though it doesn't look like they will do at first. The watercolour will dry quite a bit later. So I'm just mixing in a couple of these different types of greens, just because this is the focal point, so it adds a nice little bit of interest and variety in that area. Now for the stonework, let's just mix up a couple of colours to represent that. So the base of it, I'm going to go with yellow ochre because it's simple, it's easy, and it works most of the time. Clean the brush out a little bit. So we'll get a base colour of the yellow ochre, which is obviously quite yellow, and then just a touch of the alizarin crimson, just so I can make a slightly different mix of that. And then I'm also going to get some of the ultramarine, just to create a bit more of a grey as well, and maybe a touch of the burnt sienna. And then I want it quite a light wash, so just a touch of colour. So I'm going to squeeze the colour out of the brush, and then we'll just drop some water into that, and then this is going to be a bit more of the yellow version of this. Let's just see what that looks like. That's all right, something like that will do. And where there's areas that are lit with the bright lights that are inside, I can leave that as the white of the paper. Maybe just take a touch of colour into the bottom of these bits, but leave these archways the white of the paper. Because I'm working quite quickly, I'm going to get all kinds of little bleeds going on, but I think that adds to the effect. It adds to the looseness of the sketch. I think it's quite nice. Let's do a bit more of a grey brown on this. So just touching in some of the blue to get that more grey brown. There's a nice little kind of light square there that I've missed, so I'll just reserve that with the watercolour. I'm not going to worry about the shadows for now. We'll just put in one flat colour, and then I can go over the shadow shapes a little bit later when that's dry. So I'm just taking the excess off the brush where I want it to be a little bit lighter. Just put a touch of colour in this top one. And then maybe on this left hand side as well. These are a bit more yellow, aren't they? Bit more of a neutral grey, so all I'm doing is mixing a bit of the red, a bit of the blue, and a bit of the yellow. Maybe a touch more yellow, just to create a bit more of a neutral grey, and then needs a bit more blue in it. Just going to touch it into a few of these areas up here, but I don't want to go overboard. Just a little hint of colour will be nice. Could actually have taken some of the green into, let's mix a little bit of that up into these windows up here. It's quite a dark area, so it'll be quite a thick mix. Touch of the brown just to take some of the colour out of that. Yeah, a bit more brown maybe. Just clean the brush out. So there's hardly any colour on the palette, and I'm just picking up various different tones and tints that are on there, and it's enough colour for what I need. A little bit darker grey, so I'm going to mix up some of the ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and a little touch of the burnt sienna. Really quick way of making a nice grey. Now for the floor, it's got this reflective quality in, hasn't it? So let's try and add a few little kind of wet washes and just let some of the colour bleed into that underwash. So I'm just going to create maybe a greeny grey, so pulling some of that colour into the existing grey that's there, just using what's on the palette rather than trying to make up a new mix. Let's have a look what that looks like. Maybe a bit more colour in there, because I guess it would reflect some of the ceiling, wouldn't it? Colour that's in the ceiling. So I'm just going to work around the figures because I want to use them as an opportunity to add a little bit of spot colour. So I'm just picking up some different colours that are on the palette. Slight variations, so bits of yellows, bits of blues. I think maybe a bit more yellow somewhere. And then we'll just let that dry ever so slightly. And then while it's damp rather than wet, when it becomes damp, we'll just add a little touch of some of the darker green into just some of the areas beneath the figures, just to give that little impression that it's got that reflective quality to it. So I'm going to wait literally 60 seconds. Okay, so that's stronger green. It's a thicker mix that I had already there. And let's just drop a little bit of colour just here and there, just below the figures. See what it looks like. Just adding a little bit of red just for a bit of variety more than anything else. Maybe a touch of blue. And then let's not forget about the clock. So just do with cleaning that little watercolour pan there. And now that these side walls are dry, let's just get a slightly stronger, thicker mix for the shadows. So I'm going to go with the yellow and a touch of the blue, which is going to make it green, but then we can just neutralise that with the red. Let's have a look what that looks like. So I don't need it to be too strong, and it's already got a layer underneath, so it will show up stronger. And let's get some bright red into the flag, and also there's just a few, I'm just going to clean that up there, just a few little touches which I think would be nice little spot colours just in this information board on the right hand side. And then for the stars and stripes, I just want to make a bit more of a purpley red, just adding a touch of the blue. You could use the alizarin. And a nice ultramarine blue, touch of Prussian, and obviously I'm not going to put individual stars in, so I'm just going to dab a little bit of colour in. And then let's just finish with a few little spot colours just on these figures. So you don't want to go overboard. Blue's a good one to start with. You can do kind of jeans and stuff, and some blue tops and that. Get a bit of yellow. Just for some hair colours. Okay, so I think that will do for this sketch. Take a quick step back, have a look. Well, I certainly quite enjoyed that one. I hope going through that lesson you can see that if you break it down into the major building blocks and you stick to the basic structure, just ignore all of the detail at the start, that it is achievable and it's manageable. And there's no need to let something like this overwhelm you. So we're going to go on to sketch number 7 now. I've saved the hardest till last, I won't lie, but again, we're going to take it one step at a time, and come and join me in that one.